Welcome to week 2 of Mythology of Heroes and Villains. You'll notice that most of these weeks look like they're fairly simple in terms of assignments and that, but that's because there's a lot of reading to get through. And I want to make certain that we spend some time talking about one of the concepts in the reading. First of all, of course, you want to look at the Heroes and Villains reading about heroes and otherness. This is an important concept because the premise here is that to be a hero, you have to be somewhat separated from the society that you are trying to protect or defend or in some way save. This otherness is in part because when we set something outside of what we see as our normal society, we can often reveal things about that society from the inside. This is a concept that we see in many types of storytelling. Any kind of heroic storytelling, you'll see somebody who has to step up and be slightly different than the group. That's why often in even your standard action movie or mystery drama or that sort of thing, you'll see a lot of people who are reacting in fear or running away or seem confused by what's going on. And then there's always that person who is somehow slightly different who steps up and does the job. But you also see that in many of those stories, that person is demonstrated to be somewhat different. If they solve mysteries, they're like a Sherlock Holmes and they have trouble interacting with the rest of the world normally, so they need a person to help them do so. Or if it's an action movie, it's usually somebody who's tormented by inner demons or that sort of thing, and therefore has some trouble being part of society. Superheroic myths, of course, obviously has somebody who has a secret identity or a costume or some way to be different than the group around them, and so on and so forth. That sort of otherness is what allows the hero to act in a way that most of us don't think we can, and therefore be able to do things that most people cannot do. And is a way to set up a story that is dramatic. Of course, obviously, we when we think of real life heroes, we think of people who are part of society, firemen, police officers, doctors, emergency nurses, even teachers and social workers. Everybody who does something important in our society in what we would consider a heroic way are part of that society necessarily, but then also they are not extremely dramatic. They don't stand out. They are not somebody we often tell great stories about because they are part of who we are, and therefore it's harder for us to turn them into a bigger than life story. So this is an important concept and one well worth reading the entire chapter and trying to get a sense of what they're saying about of what Alsford is saying about what this means to do this sort of thing. Some of his examples, of course, are from a little bit longer ago. For example, he uses some references to a TV show that ended in the early 2000s, but it still is a useful point. So the crash course video is about a concept we should be highly aware of, which is the hero's journey. And this is the page that you're linked to as a quote unquote supplemental reading. Mostly this just helps summarize in pictures and gives you links to various other ways to go about it of what the hero's journey is. And this is a structural way of looking at most of these kinds of myths. It is important to note, and I cannot emphasize this enough, that not all stories about heroes follow these things. Not everything has all of these elements in it, and not all the stories about heroes will even cover most of this, or they won't cover, or they'll only cover bits and pieces of it. And sometimes you actually have to kind of squint and kind of distort what's actually happening in the story to make it fit. The reason I want to say that is because any universal structure that we look at as a story for things, for example, here's the Wikipedia page about it, requires us to not necessarily look at a story itself, but see how its parts fit into a different whole. And this can be dangerous because what that means is we are sometimes ignoring what's in the actual story so that we can make it fit in a nice way with what we see as the structure. So when you look at things in terms of the heroic journey and the monomyth, don't try to make things fit. Remember that these are just ways to help us describe things. It is some elements are there, some elements are not there. If you'll notice, Joseph Campbell was writing in 1949, Some of these other people have more updated things, more essential things, different ways of looking at it based on different viewpoints. And so they're well worth looking at as well, especially Christopher Vogler. He has come out of a tradition of examining these sorts of myths. The general elements, though, of the call to adventure and refusal and crossing the threshold and all these sorts of things are useful to think of in terms of how, when we are trying to say something meaningful about a story, and I want to talk about a certain element in a story. For example, last week, if I want to talk about the Superman story, this week I want to talk about the Matrix story. How can I use a how can I make this into a idea that can be described in ways that are metaphorically important? For example, in the Matrix, if you're watching the movie, there is a moment where Neo is on the phone, he's trying to escape, and he is told to do a thing, and then he refuses to do that. Does that mean that checks off the box of refusal of the call so that this is a heroic journey? Not necessarily. It is important for the character to do that at that point in time. And yes, it is also kind of fit into the monomyth, but you don't have to have him do that. You could have had him immediately jump into it and want to be a hero all the time and it still be a heroic journey, even if he hadn't refused the call. And so I want you to think about the fact that there are other kinds of ways to tell stories. And here's a fairly decent article. There's, if you go to Google, you can find a whole bunch of these about alternatives to the hero's journey. Other ways of thinking about it, other ways to break down the kinds of stories that can help you tell the story. You should be aware, by the way, that certain people, for example, the writers of The Matrix and the George Lucas and other people, are consciously trying to fit some things within the heroic journey, although they're not trying to check off all of the parts. But when you think about and examine the journey and the monomyth, try to think about how it can point to ideas, not that the story must be part of this. All right. So then the discussion post, of course, I want you to go over the readings. I want you to talk both about the video that is about the hero's journey and the book chapter, but I also want you to actually think a little bit about The Matrix. The Matrix is an older movie, obviously, these days. I think it's 20 years old now. But what it is helps, just as Star Wars did for an earlier generation, it kind of takes the universal mythological aspects of these kinds of stories, the action movie, the kung fu movie, the computer movie, and kind of ties them all together into a mythology. And so it's important to ask these kinds of deeper questions about all these things. What is it being said? What is it that even a silly movie or a kung fu scene in a movie is trying to say beyond just, isn't this cool to look at? Because most people are trying to say more than just what's on the screen. I'm changing the wording a little bit. I said, each post should be about 100, 200 words long. That's awfully short if you're trying to cover three different things. Each part should be about 100, 200 words long. So it should be anywhere from 300 to 600 words for a total post. Now, I'm not counting words closely, but I have a good sense of what 300 words looks like as opposed to 200 words. So, try to give some time and thought to each aspect of these questions. And of course, same thing with the responses. I noticed that when you're doing 50-word responses, it can be hard to actually expand on your thoughts. So try to get closer to 100 words for each response. And the response is an actual paper. It's about 500, 700 words long. That's about 2 to 4 or 5 pages long, depending on font you use. Although you should be trying to go with MLA fonts. If you aren't certain what the style should be, it's on the Purdue Online Writing Lab website. And actually, I'll pull that up for you real fast. And so if you haven't spent any time navigating this yet, look for MLA style. There you go. So there's the MLA style introduction for what it looks like and style guide. And it will give you general formats. Here's what the paper should look like. It'll also give you ideas for what the paper style should be. One thing to be aware of is paper style should be Times New Roman, 12-point font, double spaced, remove the extra padding between paragraphs, that sort of thing. So they will give you more information here when you look through everything. And you can see here where the highlights those sorts of fonts and things like that. Do I care a lot about whether or not you follow that format? No, not a huge amount, but what I want to make certain you're doing is trying to get as close to the style as you can, because sometimes it's very important to understand how to fit these things. So the idea here is a short analysis. So you want to ask these kinds of questions. The kind of question I'm talking about with not just the hero's journey, but just what does something mean? What is something trying to say? I have you some questions to look at. You don't have to try to answer all of these questions. You can if you want, but it is probably more useful to try to answer one or two of them. For example, choose one of the larger videos, and by that I mean the supplemental videos from the reading outside the reading. So all Star Superman, Jessica Jones, The Matrix, NCIS, Person of Interest, The Steen. If you've seen any of those already before taking the class, it will be helpful. You can talk about those, the ones that are still to come or ones you've already watched, in the crash course videos, supplementary readings, that sort of thing. And look at it and think about this. How does it fit within the heroic journey? Or what kind of role does this mythology play in modern society? So, for example, if I'm talking about the heroic journey, why is the heroic journey at all useful to the storytelling now? Or if we're talking about a mythology of the detective who solves crimes, what role does that play in modern society? That sort of thing. How do superheroes compare with mythological heroes? Because you've already seen one about a superhero, and The Matrix, let's be honest, is a movie about a superhero. His costume just happens to be black leather, and or which is more compelling in the text you've chosen. Are you more interested in the hero or the villain, and why do you think that is? And you look at other places for information. For example, if you want to talk about Superman, I'm a big fan of scholar.google.com. This helps you find online scholarly sources for things. Obviously, with Google, search terms matter, so you may want to try to double check what kind of things you're looking at. For example, you may want to do Superman ethics if you want to try to know your types of questions and see what that kind of means, that sort of thing. Also, I'm a big fan of using Wikipedia for initial research. For example, you may not know that much about the character's origins. You may just be aware of this character and what you've seen in the movies or whatever. And so you can scroll through here, get an overall sense of the character and their history. And then, of course, this is what is the most useful part of Wikipedia is references. So you may want to go, okay, this idea here is a cool idea. I read more about that? Obviously, superheroes, you're going to have some little trouble trying to navigate between all the geek stuff as well as the scholarly stuff, but some of it is in there. So it's worth looking at. So those are the main assignments. I'm not going to be incredibly strict about this, but you do need to have two sources. I want you to cite those sources in MLA format. If you're not certain how MLA format looks, that's why you have the Purdue page. Here's what in-text citations look like, and here's what the works cited page looks like. So works cited page is here, and these are the basic rules for it. If you have any other questions, for example, how to cite books or periodicals or electronic sources, those are all answered for you. And citation style inside the text. These will give you good rules of thumb. One thing to think about is in-text citation, the point isn't to have a parentheses. The point is to tell me if you're quoting something or having information, I can look at a word here and quickly look at the works cited list and see where that matches up. So if you're citing Wordsworth, I can link real fast and go, oh, there's Wordsworth in the works cited page, so I can see where you're coming from. So always try to think about how you can more naturally put in your citation than just put in the parentheses. Parentheses are only necessary if there's information that isn't given in the text, or, for example, who it is and that sort of thing. Another thing is if you're citing articles, always try to cite the author of your text, so Wordsworth as opposed to lyrical ballads, and never try to cite publisher. Don't cite Oxford unless you can't help it. unless you don't have anything else. And if you don't have anything else except for publisher information, you probably need a better source. All right, I think that's the basics for this week. If you have any questions, as always, you can shoot me an email, and I will talk to you later. Oh, by the way, before I finish this, I usually try to get grading done. For example, of the discussion posts by the Wednesday that follows. So you can look at a previous week's discussion posts and my responses to them before you start going into the next week's posts. And I usually try to get your papers graded within a week. And I will. You will usually have a rubric and as well, or comments on the papers when you come back. So if you have any other questions, let me know, and I will see you next week.